All right, hello everyone. So this time, um, the what I'm gonna do is a little bit different, and it's going to be a little bit of an exploration of free will and determinism, and I'm going to go through chapter 5 of Bob Kane's fantastic intro book, A Contemporary Introduction to Free Will. This appeared first, I think, in 1996. It had more recent reprints. And there is now a new, very good intro book by, I think, Michael McKenna and Derek Pierbaum. I can recommend that also to people. But still, Kane is ideal, and I'm teaching at university with this book. So every week I have two sessions with my students. For 2 hours we cover a chapter from the Kane book, and then for 2 hours we go through some recently published article. And what I want to do now is just to sort of go through the notes that I've made on this chapter. Obviously, the chapter is about 10, 15, 20 pages. So I make my own notes when I read it, and then before the class, I tighten them up a little bit. This is good practice, I think, if you're teaching, because you don't need all the details. Your students are supposed to read the material, and some of the things are, of course, easier. They understand it on their own, even if they are less senior students and less experienced with philosophy. So it's a good practice one time to go through it and delete the parts that you don't necessarily need, or add little clarifications and fixes where you need them. So in this chapter, on a book on free will, basically what Bokin is covering is that some people think that if we really want to argue that there is free will, then we need an explanation, and we need some kind of extra ingredient beyond just the physical bodily resources that we have based on our everyday thinking about the world and based on science. And of course, one traditional way of saying that, okay, we have free will because there is such an extra thing was mind-body dualism, and mind-body dualism claims that the mind is something entirely distinct from the body. Bodies are in space; they have extension, and as such obey natural laws. And minds are different; they subsist or persist. They don't exist in the same way as bodies do. They are real through time, but they're not material. They don't have coordinates, and as such, they are not subject to natural laws. They are not affected by gravity. They are not necessarily affected by causal laws in the same way. Um, if we have this view, of course, we have to explain how minds are connected to bodies, and the idea would be that there's some kind of special connection. And this is what would explain why freedom is possible, because um, the mind is not the kind of thing that's determined by other kind of deterministic processes in the world. So the libertarian incompatibilist, the person who believes that free will and determinism are incompatible, either one or the other has to be true, and wants to say that there is freedom, so determinism isn't true universally, there are some exceptions from determinism, will claim that, look, this extra ingredient, in this case our minds, which are not material, explain that there can be two actions which have the same physical background, and the laws of nature are identical in both cases. However, the two identical agents under the same circumstances still can act in different ways because their minds might be different. The non-physical determinants of their actions would be different. Now, there are, of course, some obvious problems with this kind of view, despite its abstractions, and one of them would be you have to explain in more detail about the metaphysics of the mind or soul, however you call this extra ingredient, and that's not that easy, right? Because we have a naturalistic metaphysics of the world at the moment. The natural sciences are doing a pretty good job of explaining most things that occur in our world, and we have to have very strong reasons or a very attractive argument to accept a different kind of idea. And we have to also take into account mental determination, right? Because the libertarian incompatibilists' his pitches is that there is free will, and there's free will because determinism isn't universally true. So that's why maybe the mind helps to explain how there can be freedom. But it does seem that the mind determines in certain ways what we do, right? When I decide something, what I decide will cause and hopefully structure my actions. If I make an intention, that's going to structure my behavior throughout maybe a longer time. If it's a complex intention, like a plan to graduate from university, to get a certain kind of job, to have a certain kind of family life, or life with my friends, or do a complex hobby, like say play football or play squash through the long term, go watch some videos, I'm going to train, I'm going to meet my friends. These things do seem to be mental activities, but they do determine our actions. So, how do they exactly help with freedom? And they're, of course, also backwards connected with our motivations. So, they do seem to be at least partially determined or probabilistic. So, if physical event E1 happens at time 1, T1, and it causes physical event 2 at time T, then the occurrence of E1 at T1 is determined that E2 occurred at T2, right? This is a standard deterministic position. Now, assuming that there is a mental spiritual entity that is not physical, doesn't do away with the worries about determinism, because it seems true that if mental event happens at T time 1, mental event 1 happens at time 1 and causes mental event 2 at time 2, then the occurrence of E1 at T1 determined that E2 occurred at T2. Now, this is something so obvious, and I covered it with my students so many times that I don't want to include it on the handouts. I would like to keep the handouts to a maximum of 4 pages, so I can print them on 2-page, flip the paper, 2-page. Also, a handout is just there to refer to. It shouldn't replace the whole chapter, and students should make their own notes if they want to work more seriously with that chapter. So libertarians have to say that two actions can have the same physical and mental background, and the laws of nature be identical under both conditions, while the agent may still do something else, but they have to explain how that's possible, right? Now, one of the sort of ways we can go with this, and one of the ways philosophers have gone with this, has been Kant's way. We can save a line here, make things a little bit more simple, and get a nicer outline, a nicer view of what's going on in the text. So, Immanuel Kant's distinction. Immanuel Kant, and this is going to be an extremely simplified reconstruction of what his view and idea is, but it's nevertheless a workable, decent one. So he distinguishes between phenomena and noumena in the world. And phenomena are how things appear to us humans, how we experience things, and how our mental and physical abilities make it possible for us to think about the world, engage with the world, right? What kind of eyes we have limits, for example, what we can take in. There are more colors, more kinds of light rays in the world than what we see. The structure of our eyes and our nervous system limits what we can experience, what kind of information we can take out from the world. Same is true of our abilities. There are all kinds of logical steps that can be taken, but for most of us, the very complex ones are almost impossible. Whereas a very strong statistical engine can do them, maybe. And the noumena is how things are in the world in themselves. So even if no human would exist, certain things would be the way they are, right? That we exist doesn't really change anything about the how things are going on Neptune, planet Neptune, or in a different galaxy, or even our Earth. Many things would be the same way, right? The core of our Earth would have formed in exactly the same way, even if humans would not exist. So it is possible that our best human attempts at understanding the world cannot make sense of freedom, because freedom might be something that does exist in itself, but we humans are limited in such ways through the structure of our mind, the structure of our body, our biological, chemical constitution, in our sensory constitutions, that we can only experience and think about the world as causally ordered and deterministic. We can't really make sense, but that's more of a limitation of our abilities and capacities, Kant says, rather than the world. The world might contain in itself freedom. So Kant accepted Newtonian physics, that the world is deterministic, and that's the best understanding that we can have of how things go in the world. But nevertheless, he thought that we should believe in free will because obviously we do experience responsibility as well, and we need it also to keep human communities going. And we have some standards of reason, what counts as rational, how what is the basis of holding other people accountable for whether or not they make good choices based on good reasons, sound reasoning. And to have these standards, we need to assume that people are in charge of their actions and their thinking. If they are not, then right, we can't really blame them for what they're doing and so on. So we need to assume that there is this kind of freedom. If we can't make sense of it, if the best version of what the world is can only make sense of the world as a deterministic place, then that means that it's probably our limitation that causes us to experience and think about the world in this way. So this is an interesting way of looking at it and trying to make room for free will. So let's make a couple of cuts to save a few lines and make it a little bit more uh, concise. So yeah. Hmm. Right. So you just want to make a couple of small cuts. Usually, when you're going through the text, you don't need to throw out a lot, um, but just to ensure that it's a little bit easier to read and go through. Um, and Of course, I keep a version which is my full notes. It's not like I'm deleting what I already made. Um, but this version is going to go into print, and I'm going to use it in the seminar I'm teaching in the afternoon. All right, so there's a difference in Kant's view between natural laws and moral laws. Natural laws are not things we can disobey; they simply control things, right? Whereas moral laws are normative laws. We should follow them, but we can fail at this. Obviously, people are often irrational. There is a law that they should help someone who is in trouble, and they can do so at very limited cost, but they don't do it for all kinds of reasons. Uh, and there, of course, people are irrational. These kind of cases happen a lot. People sometimes should help themselves, but they don't do it. They do something that's actually harmful for themselves, but doesn't help themselves. So these kind of cases, people can fail at doing what they should be doing, but we can't disobey in this way or fail to follow. We can disobey or fail to follow, but moral laws we can fail to follow. And it is part of our autonomy that we can decide to act in different ways. We give the laws that we follow to ourselves, Kant says. So our practical and theoretical perspective clash, right? Because according to our perspective of natural world, we are entirely governed by laws that we simply have no control over, and there is no exception of following them. However, when we look at our practical perspective, making decisions, then the best version we can come up with about how things are going does include decision making and freedom. So this is Kant's view. It's sort of controversial. Of course, not everyone accepts it, but it is one way to argue about how freedom is possible. Now, another way is agent causation. It's not the same as Kant's view. Kant may have defended some kind of agent causation view, but he has a quite unique and complex view about how exactly agents act. So agent causation is saying something interesting. Agent causation says that we don't need an extra factor, so we don't need a soul, we don't need a mind that's different from the body to explain our freedom. But there is a special way of causation. Most causation happens between events, right? The billiard ball is rolling, there's one event, it hits the other ball, and hitting the other ball causes the second ball to start rolling. So one event causes the other event. And this is how the world works according to most deterministic models of the world, including how we humans work. So E1, E2 are in the sequence events occurring in space and time, and dot 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 is a causal connection between events. We don't need to add this in the handout because my students have seen this many times. I explain things regularly in this way. But we have what I call extra element views, or Kane calls them this way as well, I guess. And in this one, we have event 1A and event 1B. And E1A is an action, an event occurring in space and time, done by someone. And the arrow is a causal relationship. And E1B is an extra event, which can be mental, spiritual, occurring outside space and time. Now, this would be the kind of view that says, okay, what explains freedom is sort of a mental or spiritual component, non-binary, right? Now, agent causation is different from the extra element views. Agent causation suggests that there is the agent, there is a causal relationship, and then there are the events happening. So A is an agent, dot 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 is a causal relation. In E1 is an action of the agent, which is an event occurring in space and time, and E2 is a result of the agent's action, which is an event occurring in space and time again. Right. And this is according to agent causation how agents cause their own actions. And missing these kind of small things would be bad. So this is one of the reasons why we're doing the review before you go teaching. Reviewing is usually quite important. Right. Okay, so what else can we do here to tighten things up a little bit? Actually, this can just come here, right? And yeah, there we go. You can make these things stand out a bit more. Easier to follow. Save a little space. We're already down to 5 pages, and we have covered most of the main points already. So what else can we, so what exactly does agent causation say? How does it help us to understand how freedom is possible in a fundamentally deterministic world? But what kind of exception is the way we human agents cause our actions from that determinism? Well, the answer is that agent causation can help us to deal with the indeterminist condition, right? The indeterminist condition is where we have two identical agents, let's say in two parallel universes, and they're in the exact same situation in every way. The natural laws are the same, they're in the same life situation, the same moment, but they can act differently because they cause different actions. They have the power to do that. Now, for this, what we need to understand is, okay, how does causation work then, right? Because deterministic causation seems to be pervasive. It seems to apply to everything. But now we are saying that agents can cause things differently. And usually causation is understood to be a relation that holds between different occurrences, events, or processes. And it is a little bit harder to understand how it can, how states or substances like us agents, right, like chemical, biological substances, we're very complex chemical, biological substances as humans can cause certain things. We are not the kind of thing that happens. So us causing something else to happen sounds a bit funny. In everyday life, of course, we do say things like Fatu made them shiver with pleasure, or the bike scratched the car. But what we mean by this is usually, if we transcribe them into causal sentences, is that Fatu's performing her song, that event caused the audience members to shiver with pleasure or joy or sorrow or whatever emotion it evoked in them. The bike scraping of the car's door, this event of the bike scraping of the car's door is what caused that the car became scratched. And this is not the same, right? We are not saying anymore that it was the bike as a substance or object which caused the event to happen. It is an event of the bike's scraping of the car. Now, agent causation claims that we only deal with the agent, the causal relation, and the event. And in this relation, A is the agent, dot 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 is between the agent, and E1 is the agent causing of their action, and E1 is their action caused, right? So therefore, if we want to accept agent causation, we have to accept that there are two kinds of causal relations. Causation of one or more events by another event, or event, by one or more other events. It's maybe a little bit more elegant. Or and causation of one or more events by a human agent or another kind of substance. Cats can be substances, and dogs can be substances that can cause things as agents. The sun can be a substance that causes things as an agent by warming us up, and so on and so on. Now, of course, for freedom, not any agential power to cause something will be enough. Humans will have to have very specific agential powers, and that's going to be why we can hold them responsible and why we think that they can cause things in a certain way. Right. So the staff moves the stone, right? The second event causes a third event. E2 is the event of the staff's moving, dot 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 is causal relation, E3 is the event of the stone's movement. The staff's movement causes the stone's movement. Which is moved by a hand, which is here referring back to the staff, of course. So we have E1, where E1 is the event of the hands moving, and dot 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 is the causal relation, and E2 is the event of the staffs moving, right? The event of the hands moving caused the event of the staffs moving, which caused the event of the stones moving, which is moved by a man, right? So the hand belongs to a human person who moves their hand, where A is the agent, dot 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 is the causal relation, and E1 is the event of the hands moving. So now we have analyzed this neatly. It looks quite tidy and clean, and we saved a lot of space as well. It's a clear notation, I think. People can see the differences if we highlight them a bit, and they can read the key right after the highlight. So it should be easy to follow relatively, but this is just breaking up an example into steps that explain quite well anyway in the text. Okay, so this is roughly the pitch of the agent causation view. That at some point in the causal sequence, there is the agent acting rather than an event. The agent starts the sequence and not something before it. It's not like the sequence of events runs back infinitely into the past and we have no control over the past, so we cannot have any control over that sequence of events, right? If we start a sequence of events, we have control at that point what sequence of events we start. That's the agent causal idea. Now let's assess it. Thomas Reid's version of this view goes back about 300 years, is one of the classics. Why should we accept it? Isn't it mysterious? Isn't it a bit unclear? If we can only regard external as causes, external events as causes of our behaviors, we cannot understand our actions as our own, right? This is a big problem. But if we can understand our actions as originating in ourselves, then we can understand how they belong to us, why we can be blamed for them, why we are accountable for them, why we are responsible for them, why we are the authors of our own life in what we do. And also, is it fair to question agent causation just because it posits a new kind of causation? Well, causation is not that easy to understand in general, right? Our idea of transient causation, causation between events, the occurrence of one event causing the occurrence of another event, many people say this idea is based on our own experience of us causing things to occur. We experience ourselves as causally efficacious, bringing things about. And then we transfer this idea, okay, so that occurrence can also cause something. So it's not like we first understand nature and there are events, maybe not involving any living substances causing other events, and the events have the causal power to bring about the other events. And then we try to think about ourselves and probably we work like other things in nature. It's the other way around. First, the agent causalist says we understand how we can act, and then we model our idea of what's going on in nature around us on that idea. So agent causation is more basic. What are some problems, or what is a problem for this view? Well, one of the biggies is that we have an experience of agent causation, but we don't have any experience of our causing something not being determined by anything. Right? So, what does this mean? It means that even when we experience causing something, I experience sipping my tea because I decide now to sip my tea, and that's what I do. I cause myself to do this, right? I do experience that this was something I decided, and my decision caused me to do this, or led my to my brought it about that I did this. But I do not experience that my decision to take a sip of tea hasn't been determined. There might have been all kinds of determining previous events, maybe the occurrence of thirst, some digestive processes, some chemical imbalance in my body which made me desire to have a sip of tea, and so on and so on. So we do have an experience, but that does not mean that we really experience that these would be free processes. Maybe our causing things is also determined by something, and then we don't get indeterminism, and then agent causation might be true, but it doesn't explain freedom. Now, what about regress and randomness? These can also be problems for views like agent causation. Agent causation says that Mike caused his decision imminently. It wasn't determined by prior factors. Mike determined the decision when he made it. You can think about any kind of example. Mike is deliberating about where to go on holiday. Should he go to Colorado and ski with his friends, or should he travel to Hawaii and surf with his girlfriend and his girlfriend's very cool brother and dad? He's very attracted to both ideas. In the end, he decides for Hawaii because he's more of a surf man than a skiing man. And in this reason, although Mike is the one who brings about what he does, his making that decision and forming the intention to act in that way leads to his structured behavior. He's the one causing things to go that way. He has been sort of influenced by his own standing desires and preferences, like his preference for surfing or skiing. And so there was a factor which determined or influenced his action to at least some extent. Um, Now, there's also the problem of arbitrary choices. If Mike could decide either way, then it's very weird that his previous preferences and ideas don't have a causal influence on what he does, right? He might have a standing preference for surfing, but if he decides for skiing and there's no apparent reason for that, it just looks arbitrary. It doesn't look free, right? So just because we can decide in different ways, it doesn't mean necessarily that that ability is freedom. It can be randomness or irrationality. And then, although we have indeterminism, we don't have the right kind of indeterminism to be able to explain how agents can be free. And of course, there is also the problem of luck. If Jill chooses to fight the temptation to sleep 10 more minutes and gets to her meeting on time, but Jill Star chooses not to fight the temptation as a result is late, then it seems that it was rather a matter of luck how Jill chose than her free will. So if Jill gets punished or told off by her boss for being late, that's just bad luck. Why is that so? Well, it is so, the deterministic picture says, because look, in either way, Jill has been determined to do what he does. Jill Star has been determined to do what he does. Now, if all the other circumstances are the same, and there's nothing explaining why Jill chooses one way and Jill chooses the other way in the other situation, uh, if there's no explanation, no factor that would make clear why there was this difference, and it does seem that although Jill caused the action she gets told off for, there's no explanation that it's just a strange random occurrence, and then how can we hold her responsible for it? So again, rather than getting full-fledged freedom and moral responsibility, agent causation seems to deliver us rather a puzzling situation where someone took an arbitrary choice and they had bad luck. And there's also another issue, which is usually called the infinite regress problem. If the agent needs to make a choice about choosing that she will not succumb to temptation and turn off her alarm and go back to sleep 10 more minutes, snooze a bit more, then we can again ask, why is the making of that choice not a question of luck? If agent causation replies that it is a choice of the agent which determined that the agent chose to get up or not to get up, go back and snooze a bit more, then we have to say, okay, so why is that choice not a matter of luck? Well, because the agent determined it by choosing so. And we are embarking on this infinite regress where each choice is determined by a previous choice. We are trying to anchor the responsibility somehow in the agent, but this way we don't really get there. We're just getting an infinite regress, right? We have to make infinite decisions. And the agent doesn't really cause anything in an interesting way on this view. Now, how can we avoid the regress? Some defenders of agent causation claim that agent causation is not an event, but just a relation of the agent determining the event. So if you think back of the way we illustrated agent causation, the agent has a causal relation to the event. An event is an occurrence, but that the agent causes the event is not an occurrence. There is one complex event here, the agent standing in a certain kind of relation to the first event. And the agent causal theory says this complex event has a property that one of the agent's key powers, their decision making power, was involved in this event. And hence we don't need to posit or suppose that there was a previous event as well. So this is not like we have to say that, oh, something previous occurred and that took time and that was another event. There's no infinite line of decision makings going back. There's just a one episode of decision making, and that's its own cause. Now, the problem is that we want to say that this is not random, but we also want to say that this episode, this event, has not been determined by previous events. And then we owe a more detailed explanation of how this can be non-random. If nothing that happened previously determines it's happening, then what are the properties of the agent involved? What are the agent's capacities or abilities that play such a role in this event of decision making that they can make it non-arbitrary, non-random? They can make it such that this first event that the agent is making a decision can ground the agent's responsibility, despite there not being an explanation of why the agent decided that way in terms of previous determining events. So this is the task that a good view of agent causation has to deal with. And some agent causation views do this better, some don't do this very well. Okay, so what else can we do? We can cut a couple more sentences here and there to make it a little bit more tidy, and then we should be more or less done. And I can give my students some discussion classes. Maybe they can make a little map of the positions. They can talk a bit about how they would align, what they're sympathetic to, and that would fill out 2 hours very, very easily. So if you're teaching on this kind of topic, this is one way to go about this chapter. Again, the Robert Kane book is fantastic. It offers very clear, very nice explanations of things. And right. Causation by one or more events, and causation by human agents or other substance. I like to highlight some of the main things. It's good to have these laid out. Um, and right. Hmm. Some of these things can be a bit tidied up. Right. We can change the notation a little bit to save a little time, little space. And we can probably tighten up this regress issue. If the agent needs to make a choice about choosing that she will not succumb to temptation, then we can. Then it seems that the agent also had to make a choice to choose that way. And then we are embarked on the regress, right? Yep. So we get the regress issue a little bit easier. Avoiding the regress, yeah, we have to say this. We don't need to go more into the detail. And yeah, and then we can say that this is a task of agent causation, and then we are done. It all fits exactly on 4 pages, so it should be nice and tidy. We can have a preview, a print preview, and so the way it should look should be 2 pages per sheet, right? And print double-sided. We're gonna give it a landscape orientation. I don't know why it's not putting it on, why it's not showing us, but it's gonna look just fine at the moment. Somehow it's playing around a little bit with the preview, but it should be okay. And that's that. We have covered this chapter in the Kane book. This is an intro book again, so not terribly deep. In the session after this, I'll teach my students Tim O'Connor's article on agent causation. It's a much deeper, detailed article. He defends a particular brand of agent causation, and as such, it's a lot more detailed, and it answers many of the problems and issues that came up with agent causation here. And I might cover that in a video as well. Anyway, thank you so much for joining in today, and see you around.